January 12, 1945. A cold rain fell across Camp McCain, Mississippi, turning the red clay roads into rivers of mud. Inside the women's barracks of this hastily converted prisoner of war facility, 23 German women stood at attention, their gray auxiliary uniforms hanging loose on frames that had grown thin during months of wartime deprivation and the long journey across the Atlantic. They had been captured in France during the final chaotic weeks of the German retreat. Members of the Women's Auxiliary Corps who had served as radio operators, clerks, and medical assistants for the Wehrmacht. Now they stood on enemy soil surrounded by a country they had been taught to hate and fear. Captain Virginia Caldwell walked slowly down the line of prisoners, her boots clicking against the wooden floor. She was one of only 3 female officers assigned to oversee this unusual facility, and she had spent the previous week studying military protocols for handling women prisoners. Nothing in her training had prepared her for the reality of these hollow-eyed young women, some barely out of their teens, all of them carrying the weight of defeat and uncertainty about what would come next. Among the prisoners stood 24-year-old Anneliese Bergman, though everyone back home had called her Lisa. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, maintaining the military bearing that had been drilled into her during her service. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back severely from a face that had once been round and cheerful, but now showed the sharp angles of prolonged hunger. She clutched a small canvas bag that contained everything she owned in the world. 2 photographs, a worn prayer book, and a single letter from her mother dated April of 1944. Nothing had come since. Captain Caldwell's voice was firm but not unkind as she addressed the prisoners through an interpreter. "You will be assigned work duties beginning tomorrow. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care." She paused, observing their expressions. Most showed nothing, faces carefully blank, but she noticed a few whose eyes widened slightly at the mention of adequate food. Lisa felt something stir inside her at those words. Adequate food. She could barely remember what that meant. In Germany, rations had been cut again and again until meals became exercises in creative scarcity. Bread made more from sawdust than flour. Soup that was mostly water, with a few vegetable scraps floating like lonely islands. And sugar. When had she last tasted real sugar? Not the bitter chemical substitutes they called ersatz, but actual sweetness that didn't leave an aftertaste of chemicals and disappointment. That night, lying on her narrow cot, Lisa listened to the rain drumming against the roof and the quiet sobbing of Hildegard Richter in the bunk beside her. None of them knew what tomorrow would bring. They were prisoners in a strange land, thousands of miles from home, facing an uncertain future. But at least, Lisa thought, with something that wasn't quite hope, they had been promised adequate food. Lisa's mind drifted back to the spring of 1942, when the rationing had truly begun to bite. She had been 21 then, working as a clerk in the municipal offices of Hamburg, still living in her family's apartment near the Ulster. Her mother had called her into the kitchen one morning, holding up their ration cards with a grim expression that Lise had never seen before. "No more sugar this month," her mother had said quietly. "They've reduced it again. 50 grams per person, and even that's not guaranteed." Lisa remembered laughing, thinking it was temporary. The war would be over soon, everyone said. Germany was winning. The sacrifices were necessary, but brief. She had been so naive then, so utterly convinced by the propaganda that filled the newspapers and radio broadcasts. But the war didn't end, and the sugar didn't come back. By 1943, when Lisa had volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Corps, believing she was serving her country's defense, sugar had become a distant memory. In its place came the ersatz substitutes, saccharin tablets that dissolved into bitter approximations of sweetness, leaving a metallic taste that lingered for hours. Her mother had tried making desserts with them, attempting to create the pastries that had once been Sunday traditions. The results were inedible, but they had eaten them anyway, pretending not to notice the wrongness. Lise remembered her younger sister Clara's birthday in October of 1943. She had been granted brief leave and returned home to find their apartment smaller somehow, darker. Clara had turned 16, and their mother had saved rations for weeks to make a cake. When they cut into it, the interior was dense and gray, sweetened with saccharin and stretched with potato flour. Clara had taken one bite, and tears had rolled down her cheeks. Not tears of gratitude, but of loss for all the birthday cakes that had come before, the ones with real sugar and butter and eggs, the ones that had tasted like celebration instead of deprivation. "I can't even remember what real cake tastes like," Clara had whispered. Lisa had held her sister's hand across the table, unable to offer comfort because she couldn't remember either. The taste of actual sweetness had faded from memory, replaced by the chemical bitterness of substitutes and the constant gnawing hunger that had become their normal state. By 1944, even the ersatz sugar had become scarce. Coffee had long since disappeared, replaced by roasted acorns ground into a brown powder that bore no resemblance to the real thing. Chocolate was a fantasy from another life. Lise had been stationed in France by then, working in communications, and even there, in occupied territory, German rations were meager. The French civilians they encountered looked at them with hatred, but also with a kind of grim satisfaction, as if they knew that the occupiers were starving too. Now, lying in an American prison camp, Lisa tried to imagine what adequate food might actually mean. Would there be real bread, real coffee? She didn't dare let herself hope for sugar. That belonged to a world that no longer existed, a world before the war had stripped away everything sweet. The women's first work assignment came the morning after their arrival. Captain Caldwell announced that they would be rotating through various duties, but the initial group would begin in the kitchen facility. Lisa found herself assigned alongside Hilda, Elfie, and Mina, following Corporal Floyd Mercer down a muddy path toward a large wooden building that smelled impossibly of cooking food. Private Roscoe Tate stood waiting inside, a tall man from rural Alabama with kind eyes and hands scarred from years of farm work. He looked the four German women up and down, noting their thin frames and cautious expressions, then gestured toward the industrial stoves and preparation tables. Through halting communication, a mixture of basic German phrases and hand gestures, he explained their duties: peeling potatoes, washing dishes, preparing vegetables for the evening meal. But what stunned the women into silence was the sheer abundance surrounding them: sacks of flour stacked against the walls, crates of fresh eggs, bins of potatoes that weren't half rotten or sprouting. Real coffee, the smell so rich and unfamiliar after years of acorn substitute that Lisa felt tears spring to her eyes. And sugar. 50-pound bags of actual white sugar, sitting openly on shelves like something ordinary rather than the precious commodity it had become in their memories. Hilda made a small sound in her throat, barely audible. Elfie's hands trembled as she reached for a potato peeler. Mina simply stared, her face blank with shock. Lisa forced herself to look away from the sugar, focusing on the task at hand, but her mind reeled with calculations. One of those bags contained more sugar than her entire neighborhood in Hamburg had seen in the past 2 years. Private Tate noticed their reactions but said nothing, simply showing them how he wanted the potatoes prepared. As they worked, Lisa watched him pull out ingredients for the evening meal with casual abundance that seemed almost obscene. He cracked a dozen eggs without counting, added butter to a pan with a generous hand, and when some flour spilled onto the floor, he simply swept it away rather than carefully gathering every precious grain. The waste horrified her. Back home, her mother would have wept over a single spilled egg. Here, abundance was so complete that accidents barely registered. Corporal Mercer entered, carrying more supplies, and Lisa heard him joke with Private Tate about whether they had enough bacon for breakfast. Enough bacon. As if having enough of anything was a reasonable expectation. During their lunch break, the women were given plates of food that contained more calories than they had typically eaten in an entire day back in Germany. Real bread with actual butter. Vegetable soup thick with ingredients. Coffee that tasted like coffee. They ate in silence, each bite a reminder of everything they had lost, everything their country had been unable to provide while promising victory. That afternoon, Sergeant Otis Pemberton arrived in the kitchen carrying 2 large boxes, and everything changed. Sergeant Otis Pemberton was a stocky man from Tennessee with a handlebar mustache and a reputation for fairness among the guards. He set the 2 boxes down on the preparation table with a solid thunk, then looked at the 4 German women who had stopped their work to watch him warily. Private Tate came over, peered into the boxes, and broke into a wide grin. "Doughnuts from town," Sergeant Pemberton announced to no one in particular. Baker's wife made extra for the camp, figured the boys would appreciate something sweet. He began unpacking the boxes, revealing dozens of golden brown rings, their surfaces glazed with sugar that caught the afternoon light streaming through the kitchen windows. The smell hit Lise first. It was beyond anything she could have imagined after 3 years of deprivation. The scent of fried dough, of real sugar, of something made purely for pleasure rather than mere survival. She felt her knees weaken slightly and gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Beside her, Hilda had gone completely still, her eyes fixed on the doughnuts with an expression that bordered on pain. Sergeant Pemberton noticed their reaction. He stood there for a moment, studying the 4 women, seeing, perhaps for the first time, not enemy soldiers, but hungry young people who had forgotten what sweetness tasted like. He picked up one of the doughnuts, held it for a moment, then walked over to where Lise stood frozen. "Here," he said simply, holding it out to her. "Try it." Lisa stared at the offered doughnut, her mind unable to process what was happening. This was a trap, surely, or a test, or some form of mockery. Why would an American soldier share food with a German prisoner? Everything she had been taught about the enemy contradicted this moment. Private Tate nodded encouragingly. Corporal Mercer, who had returned to witness the scene, stood quietly by the door. "Go on," Sergeant Pemberton said, his voice gentler now. "It's just a doughnut, nothing to be afraid of." Lisa's hand moved almost without her conscious will. She took the doughnut, feeling its weight, still slightly warm from the bakery. The glaze stuck to her fingers, actual sugar coating her skin. She looked at Hilda, at Elfie, at Mina, seeing her own confusion and longing reflected in their faces. Then she looked back at Sergeant Pemberton, who had stepped back to give her space, waiting. She raised the doughnut to her lips and took a bite. The taste exploded across her tongue with such intensity that she gasped. Real sugar, real sweetness, without the chemical bitterness of ersatz substitutes. The dough was soft and rich, made with real flour and eggs and butter. It tasted like everything she had forgotten about life before the war, like Sunday mornings and birthday celebrations and her mother's kitchen when the world still made sense. Tears rolled down Lisa's cheeks as she chewed, unable to stop them, unable to speak. Lise couldn't stop crying. She stood in the American military kitchen, holding a half-eaten doughnut, tears streaming down her face while Sergeant Pemberton watched with growing concern. It wasn't just the sweetness, though that alone was overwhelming enough to break through years of carefully maintained composure. It was the kindness, the casual generosity of sharing something precious with people who were supposed to be enemies, the simple humanity of recognizing hunger and responding with food. Hilda began crying next, then Elfie, and finally even stoic Mina's eyes filled with tears. Sergeant Pemberton looked alarmed now, clearly not having anticipated this reaction. He glanced at Private Tate, who shrugged helplessly, then at Corporal Mercer, who stepped forward and spoke quietly in his limited German. "Es ist gut. It's okay." But it wasn't okay. Nothing about this was okay. Lisa finished the doughnut, licking the sugar from her fingers, with a desperation that shamed her, and the shame only made her cry harder. While she stood here eating sweets given freely by enemy soldiers, her mother and sister were somewhere in bombed-out Hamburg, probably starving. Her neighbors, her friends, everyone she had left behind was suffering deprivation that these Americans couldn't begin to imagine. And here she was, crying over kindness from the very people whose bombs had destroyed her city. Sergeant Pemberton did something then that Lise would remember for the rest of her life. He picked up 3 more doughnuts and handed one each to Hilda, Elfie, and Mina. Not with triumph or superiority, but with simple compassion. "Go ahead," he said. "All of you, you look like you could use something sweet." The 4 women stood together, eating doughnuts in silence while tears ran unchecked down their faces. The taste was almost painful in its perfection, each bite a reminder of everything they had lost and everything they had been told was evil about America. How could people who shared their food so freely be the monsters from the propaganda posters? How could soldiers who showed kindness to prisoners be the ruthless enemies they had been taught to fear? When they finished, Sergeant Pemberton left the boxes on the table. "For later," he said simply, "if you want more." Then he left the kitchen, followed by Corporal Mercer, leaving Private Tate to supervise the rest of their work shift. The women returned to their tasks in silence, but something fundamental had shifted. Lisa's hands moved automatically, peeling potatoes, washing dishes, but her mind kept returning to that moment of unexpected grace. The doughnut had been more than food. It had been an offering of dignity, a recognition of their shared humanity despite the uniforms and the war and all the propaganda that said they should hate each other. That night in the barracks, Lise lay awake long after lights out, the taste of sugar still lingering faintly on her tongue. The doughnuts became a turning point that neither the prisoners nor their guards fully understood at first. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere in the kitchen shifted from wary coexistence to something approaching cooperation. Private Tate, emboldened by Sergeant Pemberton's gesture, began teaching the German women English words for various foods and cooking implements. Lisa discovered she had an aptitude for languages, and soon she was translating between the Americans and her fellow prisoners. Corporal Floyd Mercer started joining them during meal preparations, sharing stories about his family's farm in Georgia. He spoke slowly, using simple words, and Lisa translated for the others. They learned that he missed his wife and 2 young daughters, that he worried about them managing the farm alone, that he carried photographs of them in his breast pocket. The women found themselves sharing their own stories in return. Hilda spoke about her work as a telephone operator in Berlin. Elfie described her family's bakery in Munich, closed now for lack of flour and sugar. Mina talked about her training as a nurse, how she had wanted to help people. Captain Caldwell observed these developing connections with careful attention. She had been skeptical at first, worried that fraternization might compromise security or create problems with other prisoners. But she noticed something remarkable happening. The German women who worked in the kitchen carried themselves differently now. They stood straighter, spoke more openly, and the hollow desperation in their eyes had begun to fade. More importantly, they worked harder and more efficiently than prisoners motivated purely by fear or duty. One afternoon in early March, Private Tate brought ingredients for making biscuits and decided to teach the German women the recipe. Lise watched as he measured flour with the same casual abundance she had witnessed that first day, adding butter and buttermilk and a generous amount of sugar. He shaped the dough and placed the rounds on a baking sheet, then stepped back and gestured for them to try. Hilda went first, her hands tentative as she formed the dough. Years of scarcity had taught her to work with precise economy, using every scrap, wasting nothing. Private Tate shook his head and demonstrated again, showing her the generous portions, the relaxed technique. "Plenty more where that came from," he said, gesturing to the supply shelves. The concept seemed almost impossible to grasp. Plenty more. These words had lost meaning during the war years. But here in this American kitchen, they were simple facts. There was enough flour for mistakes, enough sugar for learning, enough food that sharing it with prisoners didn't mean someone else would go hungry. When the biscuits came out of the oven, golden and steaming, Private Tate split one open and added butter that melted into the tender crumb. He handed it to Lisa with the same casual kindness that Sergeant Pemberton had shown with the doughnut. "Try your handiwork," he said. The biscuit was delicious, and this time Lise managed to eat it without crying. April brought warmer weather to Mississippi and news that shattered whatever remained of the German women's understanding of their own country. The Americans had liberated concentration camps in Germany, and photographs were appearing in newspapers, images so horrific that many refused to believe they were real. Captain Caldwell made the difficult decision to share these reports with the German prisoners, believing they had a right to know what had been done in their nation's name. Lisa sat in the camp's small library, staring at a newspaper photograph that her mind struggled to comprehend. Skeletal figures behind barbed wire, their eyes hollow with suffering that made her own wartime hunger seem trivial by comparison. Piles of emaciated bodies, crematoria, gas chambers. The article described places called Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, camps that had existed within Germany itself, while she had been serving the Wehrmacht, believing she was part of a defensive war, believing the propaganda about protecting the fatherland. Hilda found her there, trembling, as she read. "Lisa," she whispered in German, her voice breaking. "Is this real? Did our country really do these things?" Other women gathered around the newspapers, their faces reflecting the same horror and disbelief. These were not hardened Nazi ideologues, but ordinary young women who had joined auxiliary services believing they were answering their country's call to defense. Now they confronted the possibility that they had been part of something monstrous beyond imagination. Elfie began sobbing, great heaving cries that shook her entire body. "My brother," she gasped. "My brother was SS. He told me he was doing administrative work. What if he was part of this?" Mina put her arms around Elfie, but her own face was ashen with shock. She had served in military hospitals, tending wounded German soldiers. Had she been supporting this? Had every bandage she wrapped, every soldier she helped heal, been in service of these atrocities? That evening, Lisa couldn't eat the dinner that had been prepared. The food that had seemed like such abundance, such unexpected blessing, now felt like ashes in her mouth. How could she accept kindness from Americans when her own country had committed horrors she couldn't begin to fathom? How could she taste sugar and feel grateful when millions had died in camps she never knew existed? Corporal Mercer found her sitting alone outside the mess hall, her head in her hands. He sat down beside her without speaking for a long moment. Finally, he said in his slow, careful English, "You didn't know." It wasn't a question. Lisa looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "I should have known," she said. "How could I not know? I served them. I was part of it." Mercer shook his head. "You were a clerk, a girl doing what she thought was right." He pulled out a handkerchief and handed it to her. "The people who did those things, they're not you. You can't carry their sins." But Lise wasn't sure that was true. She had worn the uniform. She had believed the propaganda. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had consumed the continent for 6 years was finally over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally, and across America, celebrations erupted in streets and town squares. But in Camp McCain, Mississippi, the mood was far more complicated. For the German women prisoners, the end of the war meant facing a question that had been building since that first doughnut, since those first acts of unexpected kindness from their captors. What came next? Captain Caldwell called a meeting of all the women prisoners in the main assembly hall. She stood before them with official documents from the War Department, her expression both professional and compassionate. "Ladies," she began, speaking slowly so Lisa could translate, "the war in Europe has ended. Arrangements are being made for the repatriation of German prisoners of war. Within the next month, you will be transported back to Germany and released to return to your homes." The words should have brought relief, even joy. Freedom, home, the end of captivity. But as Lisa translated Captain Caldwell's announcement, she saw no celebration in the faces around her. Instead, she saw fear, uncertainty, and something that looked almost like grief. What homes were they returning to? Hamburg was rubble. Berlin was divided among the Allied occupiers. Munich had been bombed repeatedly. The Germany they had left no longer existed. Reports from Europe painted a picture of devastation beyond comprehension. Cities destroyed, infrastructure collapsed, millions displaced or dead. Starvation was widespread, worse than anything they had experienced during the war itself. The occupation forces were struggling to provide even basic necessities. And beyond the physical destruction lay something darker. Germans were being forced to confront their country's crimes. Those who had served the Reich in any capacity faced suspicion, shame, and in some cases, violent retribution from their own countrymen who blamed them for the catastrophe. That night, the 4 women who had shared that first doughnut gathered in their barracks after lights out, speaking in hushed German. "I don't want to go back," Hilda said quietly, voicing what they had all been thinking, but were afraid to say aloud. "My entire family is dead. My city is destroyed. What is there to return to?" Elfie nodded, tears in her eyes. "We will be seen as failures, as soldiers who were captured by the enemy. They will say we were corrupted by American propaganda." Mina, always the most practical, spoke what seemed impossible. "What if we asked to stay?" The words hung in the darkness like something dangerous and forbidden. Prisoners of war didn't ask to remain with their captors. That wasn't how it worked. The Geneva Convention provided for their repatriation, not for their immigration. But as Lisa lay awake that night, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Here, in this enemy prison camp, she had found something she never expected. She had found dignity in her work. She had found kindness from people she was supposed to hate. She had discovered that Americans weren't the monsters from propaganda posters, but ordinary people, capable of extraordinary compassion. She had tasted sugar again, yes, but more importantly, she had tasted hope for who she might become, but it has shown us what kind of people we wish to become. The implications were staggering. There was no precedent for this, no clear legal pathway. But as Captain Caldwell looked at the 7 women standing before her, she saw not enemy soldiers, but young people caught in circumstances beyond their control, asking for a chance at redemption. She saw Private Tate nodding encouragingly from the back of the room, Corporal Mercer standing with quiet support, and Sergeant Pemberton, whose simple act of sharing doughnuts had somehow started this entire transformation. 25 years later, on a warm June morning in 1970, Lisa Bergman Henderson stood in the parking lot of what had once been Camp McCain, Mississippi. The facility had been decommissioned decades earlier, converted into a community center that served the rural county. Beside her stood her daughter Sarah, a college student who had grown up hearing stories about doughnuts and kindness, and the day her mother chose to become American. They had been invited to speak at a reunion of former camp personnel and the German women who had requested to stay. Of the original 7 who had made that unprecedented request, 5 had successfully navigated the complex legal process to remain in America. Lisa had married Floyd Mercer 3 years after the war ended, settling in Georgia, where she worked as a translator and raised 2 children. Hilda had become a teacher in Mississippi. Elfie had opened a bakery in Tennessee, finally able to practice her family's trade with abundant ingredients. Inside the community center, Otis Pemberton stood waiting, older now but still sporting his distinctive mustache. Virginia Caldwell, retired from military service, had traveled from Virginia to attend. Roscoe Tate had brought his grandchildren, wanting them to understand the story that had shaped his understanding of humanity and forgiveness. When Lisa stood to speak, she held a small leather notebook worn from years of handling. "I brought something with me today," she said. "A recipe that Private Tate taught me in 1945. A recipe for Southern biscuits that required more flour and butter and sugar than I had seen in 3 years of wartime Germany." She paused, looking around the room at the gathered faces, American and German, young and old. "But this reunion isn't really about biscuits, or even about doughnuts, though Sergeant Pemberton's simple gesture changed my life forever." Otis smiled from his seat, remembering, "This is about what happens when people choose to see beyond uniforms and propaganda to recognize shared humanity." When Sergeant Pemberton handed me that doughnut, he wasn't just giving me food, he was offering me dignity when I deserved none. He was showing me that Americans weren't the monsters I had been taught to fear, but people capable of extraordinary kindness, even toward their enemies. Sarah watched her mother speak, understanding for the first time rather than remain trapped by who she had been. The question wasn't whether returning to Germany would be difficult. The question was whether she had the courage to choose a different path entirely. The morning of May 22nd arrived with unusual tension in Camp McCain. Captain Caldwell had called an assembly to finalize repatriation procedures, and the 23 German women gathered in the main hall with faces that reflected weeks of internal struggle. But before the captain could begin her official announcement, Lisa stood up, her legs shaking, but her voice steady. She had been chosen by the others to speak, to voice the request that seemed both impossible and necessary. "Captain Caldwell," she said in careful English, each word measured and deliberate, "may I speak for some of us?" The captain looked surprised but nodded permission. Lisa glanced back at the women behind her. Hilda, Elfie, and Mina stood as well, along with 3 others who had worked in various camp facilities. 7 women total, rising together in a gesture of solidarity that they knew would change their lives forever. "We have been talking among ourselves for many weeks," Lisa continued, her accent thick, but her meaning clear. "Some of us do not wish to return to Germany immediately. We understand this is unusual. We understand we are prisoners of war and that the Geneva Convention provides for our repatriation. But we are asking if there is any possibility, any legal way, for us to remain in America instead." The words created a ripple of shock through the room. American guards exchanged confused glances. Even some of the other German prisoners looked surprised, though many nodded in understanding. Captain Caldwell stood speechless for a moment, clearly never having anticipated prisoners requesting to stay in captivity rather than accept their freedom. "I need to understand what you're asking," Captain Caldwell said slowly. "You want to remain here as prisoners?" Lisa shook her head. "Not as prisoners, Captain. We are asking if we can stay in America as displaced persons. We wish to work, to contribute, to build new lives here, if that is legally possible." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. "The Germany we are being sent back to is not our home anymore. The country we served, we discovered, was not the country we believed in. Here, we have been treated with more dignity as enemies than we had as citizens of the Reich." Hilda spoke next, her English less confident but equally sincere. "My family is dead. My city is rubble. In Germany, I will be seen as a failure, as someone corrupted by the enemy. Here, I have learned what it means to be treated as a human being." Elfie added, "You gave us doughnuts when you had no reason to show us kindness. You taught us English, shared your food, treated us with respect. We do not deserve this generosity." Full weight of the choice Lisa had made. To stay had meant never seeing Hamburg again, never reconnecting with distant relatives, living forever with the complicated identity of a German who became American, a former enemy who became a citizen. But it had also meant choosing hope over despair, redemption over resignation, and the possibility of becoming someone better than she had been. Lisa concluded by reading from her notebook the recipe Private Tate had taught her, each measurement a reminder of abundance freely shared. "The real recipe," she said, "isn't for biscuits, it's for reconciliation. The ingredients are simple: recognition of our shared humanity, willingness to offer kindness even to enemies, and the courage to choose transformation over hatred."